Great. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for coming for the session, which is around secure APIs, road for your business growth. So modern businesses nowadays, they think about how do they increase the revenue, and pretty much they are looking for opportunities like how can they be competitive against the rest of their other organizations. And in order for them to be successful, APIs play an important role. So before we get into what APIs are and why security on APIs are more important, I want us to share a little bit about myself. I'm Anu, working as a Senior Solutions Architect for Unisys New Zealand. So I have got 15 years of experience, and as Kirk mentioned, I started my career as a developer, and currently I'm an architect. You may be thinking of why an architect's speaking at a conference like a security conference. I think security is a common topic. It doesn't need to be a developer needs to be thinking about security. I think every IT professional should be thinking about security. And it is common across all the aspects of software development and the software lifecycle. So I'm really passionate about data, integration, and BI. So it's more around how much data that we are collecting and how that data can be provided to the consumers. But when we talk about data and we talk about sharing data, we need to be really careful like what we are sharing with them too. So we don't want to share every single sensitive information with them. We need to be really careful of what we need to be providing to them and what we need to be securing from them. So if you have any other questions or if you need to reach out to me after this session, so my LinkedIn, Twitter, and my blog profiles are available in the PowerPoint, and you can reach to me. Great. So the agenda for this session, so I'll just briefly, I'll introduce about what APIs are, and I think pretty much most of the audience will know here, so it will be a quick slide, and what API security is about, and what do we mean by underprotected APIs. So why do we really care about API security? So also trying to understand what are the impacts. If you don't secure an API, it's good to understand what are the impacts because of that. And I think I don't know how many of you have been sitting in this session, in this room for the whole morning sessions. I think they touched on various topics around security, especially about not scaring about things, because security, when people talk about it, immediately they get scared. It's not about that. Let us face it, and okay, let us prevent how can we avoid those attacks. So also trying to give some examples of underprotected APIs, and how do we detect them, as well as how do we protect them. So what are APIs? APIs are nothing but applications programming interface. So if you look at why organizations use APIs, because they want to extend their functionality and reuse it wherever possible, rather than reinventing a wheel. Today I may have a website, and I want to just show my products and ask my customers to order their products on the website, and tomorrow I want to create a mobile application, and pretty much I want to give the same functionality. Rather than trying to build this functionality in multiple places, you can build an API, and pretty much you can try and utilize it. So this is just a graph from Programmable Web. I think I don't know how many of you are familiar with this website. So if you are into APIs, I will definitely recommend to browse this website. They have got a whole range of open source or public APIs that are available, and also some best practices around when you're thinking about building APIs, how you need to be thinking about designing them also. So if you look at this graph, like since 2006, the growth of APIs has been really huge, and we are currently in 2018, but this shows really how much rapidly the number of APIs are growing in the community. So if you look at that, companies like Netflix, they are pretty much able to stream over 200 devices just because of APIs. And if you look at Twitter, like there are around 12 billion of tweets on a daily basis, and thanks to API because of that. And so all these things, if we can, certain things which we can imagine before, it's all now doable is because of the APIs. So why API security is really important. So we saw about the growth of the APIs and how much it can be reusable in multiple applications or devices. So if you look at a traditional web application, normally like you have a traditional website and you have hosted on a HTTP server, then you have an application server, pretty much has got all the business functionality in it. behind the scenes you will have a database. So this is how historically we used to develop applications. What happens is in the application server, that is where your business logic and things have been hosted, that takes care of like, okay, who should be accessing the data, and it manages the control pretty much. So it knows exactly, okay, so if the call is coming from this website, I should be giving this information. But we are in the world of APIs, where we are saying like, okay, I will expose everything and let the consumer decide on what they want to consume. So if you look at the second diagram where you have an API-based client application, as you can see here, the granularity boundary has totally shifted. So it's no longer sitting in the app server, it is pretty much in the control of your consumers who are consuming the APIs. So which means the responsibility of securing the APIs is really important, because you are exposing, but you need to know where to set the controls around who can access what and what level. So what are underprotected APIs? So if you haven't protected your APIs, pretty much that is one of the core concerns for any modern enterprises. Because all the enterprises are talking about the going digital, and if they want to go to digital platforms, then pretty much API are building blocks for that. So if APIs are not protected, it pretty much increases the attack surface. So normally APIs, if you think about APIs, you can have a SOAP-based API or a REST-based API. Then within that you may have like, okay, I want to expose the API as a XML payload or a JSON payload. And within that, you can start thinking about, okay, is it a REST operation, which means you have your get, post, put methods, or if it is going to be a SOAP, then pretty much you have custom operations. As you can think about this, like there are a variety of ways you can expose the data through APIs, which pretty much adds the complexity. So if you think about automating your testing of your APIs, it's really impossible for catering for all the different things that you're looking for. So then how do we really secure them? I would say think APIs like as your web applications. So the OWASP top 10 things that we were discussing, it's not just applicable for your websites alone or web applications alone. You can apply the same principles for your web APIs also, because they pretty much line up each other. So what are the impacts I'll be having if I don't protect or secure my APIs? So we can categorize the impacts into two sections basically. So you have some series technical impacts, and in some areas it also affects your business. So let me talk about business impacts first before I jump on to the technical impacts. So if your business is pretty much reliant on, or your customers are reliant on a particular critical API, and if you have a denial of service attack on those critical APIs, pretty much they may have loss in revenue itself. So if a core service of a business is not available, and nowadays like even for a few hours, that's it. So pretty much the businesses will be out of that. So the competitors would have got the market. If your critical data is compromised, that's another issue where organizations really suffer. Because in the morning sessions, we talked about how customer information is really important. Like we collect customers' contact details, email addresses, and phone numbers. Like even like losing them and attackers getting hold of those information is going to lose your customers. And also having some critical functions compromised. So these functions is saying like, okay, I can't make an order on the website. Pretty much like there is a loss in revenue straight away. When it comes to technical impacts, you can categorize them into three around data theft, data corruption, and data destruction. So I think in our previous session in this room, like we talked, like get the basics right. So that was a good message. Like we think about really complex things of how do we protect things, but we always leave the basics. So taking into account of these basic things is also really important. When I say basics in terms of API, validate your inputs. So don't think about like, okay, I have a web application, I'm using HTML5, and it will take care of validation. Because not all the clients, your clients are going to be HTML5 compliant. So if you are going to use mobile apps or anything, or some people can interact to an API in any other fashion. So make sure the API should be validating all your inputs. So I have heard that as an architect from most of my developers saying like, it's done this API is not exposed, but don't ever think about that because your API may not be exposed to any other clients right now, but in future they'll be thinking, we built something as an API, why can't we reuse it? So always think about validating your inputs upfront. Great. Some of the API examples, I'm sorry to quote WordPress again here. I think pretty much this site has been quoted many times in all the security conferences. So I think the reason for quoting WordPress is because to explain, you can do parameter manipulation. So when you manipulate the parameters, pretty much you can change the content of your blog sites or anything. So if your inputs are not clearly validated, pretty much you can just, as an attacker, you can just take control of those WordPress websites. And the other thing to keep in mind is also like a lot of websites now expose APIs, and these APIs are publicly available also. So if you take Facebook, if you take Twitter and LinkedIn, all these websites now give valuable APIs, but also they give a really good documentation, keeping like, okay, developers in mind. So if you give a good documentation for them, it's easy for them to follow and make use of that. But also it makes handy for hackers, because pretty much like they get full knowledge about your APIs and then the underlying data that you're holding without much problems. And Swagger, that goes to the next extent. Pretty much you can just try the operations and pretty much see the output of that also. So where do we stand? Like, do we expose APIs, or do we protect the APIs, or do we lock everything down? So I would say, like, yes, expose APIs, and because that's when people can start consuming your services, but make sure like put preventive measures like so that hackers don't get valuable information from your APIs so easily. So we talked about IoT also. Like with IoT devices, it goes to the next level. So because information is coming from your devices, and sometimes it can be also in plain text. So for instance, if you look at thermostats in your houses and things, if you are passing the information, the climate information or anything, pretty much you are passing the location of your house, and the privacy is breached there. So we need all these modern things, or it's always good because you get modern functionality, but also like we need to look at that from a security perspective also. So this is nothing to scare to you, but it's just making sure like we need to look at the security aspect of things when new technologies or new streams of things comes out. The final thing is a web application connected to database using API, and I have seen a lot of APIs which pretty much built over all the tables that you have created, and just give the command, you get the output straight away. So how do we prevent attackers getting access to all this information? We can do that, but before that, before we get into prevention, let us find out like what are the different ways we can detect them. So I'll go from the bottom, because I attended the API conference last year, I think last year or previous year in Auckland. So one of the presentation was from Xero, and pretty much they were using machine learning and analytics. And I thought like, okay, why am I having a machine learning and analytics session in an API conference? So it was really handy to see, because they were using machine learning and analytics in order to capture the information of who are the people accessing their APIs, what are the endpoints that are getting accessed, and how many number of requests are coming through those APIs. Pretty much they were holding all the logs and applying machine learning over there, so that they started get some patterns out of those logged information. So it was really handy. So that helped me to understand how analytics is really important even in the API space. Then you have the common API gateways. Some of these products like Apigee, MuleSoft, Azure API Management, and the APIs that are exposed by CA Technologies, all these things are really good, because the API gateway is pretty much a single layer to protect your APIs. You can manage your authentication and authorization pretty much at the API management layer. You can turn on logging at the API management layer. Then you can also like secure, saying I want to set a different set of my clients should access only different operations. All these things can be configured at the API management layer itself. So you may think about like I can do everything by hand in my API itself, but I would suggest to go for an API management gateway, because it's not just for one APIs. For n number of APIs your organization will be creating, pretty much you can have a centralized management of them. So we have tools like Postman and Insomnia REST client. So Insomnia REST client is something similar to Postman, which is really handy, and have a look at it. It has a nice graphical user interface. So all these things will allow you to just try the API operations. You can see what inputs are getting passed, what outputs are getting sent back to you, and also like you can try testing your, so these are pretty much your development tools that you can use as part of creating your APIs. Finally, you have got the ZAP and Metasploit. So this is, if you're into penetration testing, I personally am not a penetration tester, but I try to make sure like, okay, let us try and prevent all the security issues a penetration tester can find. But however you prevent it, they will find something, that's for sure. And so normally as an architect, like once I finish my application and hand over for security testing, that's a scary moment because you don't know what comes out of in the penetration testing report. But yeah, of course you can't be scary for everything, but it says like, okay, have I secured enough? Or so who knows, like by the time I study something and try to secure something, new things are coming or new vulnerabilities are coming. So it is almost security is a topic where every day you learn something new. So I would try and ask you to explore these tools, like, and I have got some URLs in the references section. So pretty much you just need to put a URL and then you can scan through and you need to go through the detailed analysis of the different issues that your particular API or website has got. As I mentioned here, anything that you are, any tools that you are using for your API, it is applicable for, for your website, is applicable for your API also. The only thing is, there is a user interface for your website, but for an API, it's not just as a user interface or anything, unless and until you build one. Great. So how do I go about protecting the APIs? First thing is, don't rush. It's so easy to say, but I think I have personally seen developers like they work on a tight time frame, and especially with Agile, every 2-week sprint, you have to deliver something. So I think security becomes an afterthought in those scenarios, but I think that's what you should be thinking about. Security should be part of, if you're a developer, security should be something that you should be considering, not thinking it as an afterthought. And then having sufficient documentation, because I think if you don't have sufficient documentation of what are the things that you have already covered and what you haven't covered, then pretty much it is really hard for anyone to understand going forward. So, and also use web API tools or the tracing tools as part of your development itself. Like rather than thinking about, okay, security, someone will be doing penetration testing after the fact, but always after the fact, if someone figures something and going back and fixing is not going to be, like your client will not be in the happy situation. But I think someone mentioned about risk registers also in the previous sessions, where they record the risk and say like, yeah, I acknowledge like there is a security risk. No one is going to put their hand up and say like, okay, I will accept this risk and go to production. So even if you're working on Agile projects, I would say like if you don't take into account of security as part of your sprints, then probably like your product may never hit into production. Great. So some of the key things that to keep in mind in terms of when you're doing API design, how can you secure your APIs? It's around validating your parameters. Sanitize all the incoming data. Don't say that it is coming from a trusted source or anything. Pretty much you have to sanitize everything. And don't trust on just I'm using HTML5, it doesn't matter, I'm not going to get the data in any other channels. Just don't assume anything. Just pretty much validate all the inputs at your API layer. So protect against injection of all forms. So whether it's a SQL injection or is it an operating system level injection, doesn't matter. So you have to protect your APIs against all these injections. And turn on TLS everywhere and enable SSL. So still, I think a lot of websites are running HTTP only. So again, it was mentioned in a previous session, like don't just run on HTTP because anyone can look at your network traffic and capture sensitive information out of that. Implement rigorous authentication and authorization standards. When you're exposing API, always make sure like, okay, what authentication mechanism people have to be following in order to access your API. Similarly, who can access what? So like all your operations, you can't, for instance, you don't need to write a single API exposing all your operations. You can segregate them into areas or sections, and you can just apply authorization saying, okay, this particular client needs only these operations, so you can expose that and you can secure them. So start thinking about how can you slice and dice your operations in such a way like you don't need to compromise on security. and apply API security and implementation as a separate tiers. So you don't need to muddle your security along with your implementation. Keep your implementation separate, as I mentioned, and use API management gateways or things like that will take care of your authentication and authorization. And finally, as I mentioned, use analytics wherever possible, because sometimes upfront you may not know, like you may think like you have secured all the aspects of your APIs, but when you start looking at the analytics, or if you start looking at monitoring the logs, you'll find out like in what ways people are actually reaching to your APIs. So I would definitely recommend turn on analytics on your APIs, and you will find a lot of information on how do you tweak or secure your APIs based on that. So here are some of the links that you can go back and refer to. So the tools I mentioned here as part of this presentation, like you can go back and try them, and these are really handy ones, and I would recommend to use these tools as part of your development itself. And yeah, so that's it pretty much I have got for today. So when you think about APIs, I will always recommend you to think about it is similar to your web applications, that you have to think about security for them. And so how you protect your web applications, think APIs in the same fashion. Don't forget validating your inputs, and don't forget using API management gateways, because that will give value for you in long term. And thanks for coming for the session.